Hello Penrise students, this is Mr. Johnson talking to you here and producing this video for you. As you can see, we've got David Attenborough on your screen there. This is because, of course, not being in school right now means that you aren't able to do the tutor reading. If you were year 7 and year 8, you would have been starting a new book, and 9, 10, 11, you've been doing your weekly reading. Well, bringing it all together then, we've got a fantastic book which we want to share with you over the next few days and probably weeks as well. It's a book I'm going to read to you from. Basically, I'm going to try and do this in sort of 10, 15-minute sessions, and there'll be various recordings that you can work your way through and join in with the book. David Attenborough, who many of you will know is a presenter of animals documentaries on the BBC. It's fantastic. It's a really good book, and the book explores his early days. It's him narrating it and him talking about his early adventures in the 1950s when animal programs were first starting to be produced for TV. And the book is split into 3 chunks, and those are 3 different adventures in different countries. And we're going to start exploring the first one. And today what I want to do is start by reading the introduction. At the end of this video, what I'm going to do as well is set you an optional task, like a mini go away and have a go at this type thing, which is something which just extends you really. And for some of you who have a real interest in animals, then this could be really useful for you. So here it is then. What I'm going to be doing is, like we encourage you to do, particularly 7s and 8s when you've got your reading rulers, I'm going to be doing that as well, just so we can all follow along the page on the screen here. So it looks something very much like this. There it is, as called before, The Adventures of a Young Naturalist, and Zoo Quest was the name of the programme. And what I'll do is, so as I could say, there's the introduction, the contents page there, and there's 3 books. And there he is himself, a much younger version of David Attenborough. So what I'll be doing then is I'll be using my reading ruler and just have it drop down a couple lines just to help me be able to follow and read aloud, which is actually surprisingly difficult when you're under pressure, but also so you can follow on and see what's going on as well. And I'll pause if there are any words, particular words that I think are ones that are important that you may not be familiar with, and hopefully my camera will be able to keep focusing as well. So here we go, the introduction. These days, zoos don't send out animal collectors on quests to bring them back alive, and quite right too. The natural world is under more than enough pressure as it is without being robbed of its most beautiful, charismatic and rarest inhabitants. Now, most of a zoo's crowd-attracting species, lions, tigers, giraffes and rhinoceroses, even lemurs and gorillas, have been born in zoos and kept track of in stud books so that individuals can be exchanged internationally without incurring problems of inbreeding. They can then play a valuable part in familiarising visitors with the splendours of the natural world and explaining the importance and complexities of conservation. But it was not always so. London Zoo was founded in 1828 by men of science who were at the time still concerned with the important but almost impossible task of compiling a catalogue of all the species of animals alive today. Some were sent to it from distant parts of the world as dead specimens. Others arrived alive and were put on display in the Society's gardens in Regent's Park, which is in London. But both kinds ended up as well-studied anatomical specimens and carefully preserved. Needless to say, special attention was paid to finding species that no other zoo had ever possessed, and that ambition to some extent still lingered on even in the 1950s, when I visited one of the zoo's curators with an idea for a new kind of television programme. So he's talking about London Zoo there, and just the competition, how they used to go get animals and bring them back either alive or dead. And then David Attenborough was visiting in the 1950s. Television then was also very different from what it is today. There was only one network, produced by the BBC, which could only be seen in London and Birmingham. All its programmes came from 2 small studios in Alexandra Palace in North London. They were the same studio and indeed the same cameras that in 1936 provided the first regular television service in the world. Transmissions were suspended in 1939 on the outbreak of the Second World War, but then resumed as soon as peace was declared in 1945. So when in 1952 I got a job as a trainee producer, BBC Television had only 10 years of practical production experience, which is absolutely mad if you think about it. So he's working in 1950s. The guy is still working for the BBC, and I'm trying to do my quick math, 70 years later. That's how long he's been doing this. The programmes were almost entirely live. Electronic recording was still decades away, so the only way we producers had of supplementing the pictures from the studio was with film. That cost money, and we were seldom given enough to enable us to do so. This was not regarded as much of a limitation. On the contrary, both viewers and producers thought that the immediacy was the medium's main attraction. The events appearing on the screen were actually happening as viewers watched them, and if an actor forgot his lines, then the prompt was audible. If a politician lost his temper, we all saw him do so, and there was no chance of him to have a second thought and insist that incautious words were edited out. So to paraphrase what he's just saying there is TV was live. And I don't know if you can imagine now, something like EastEnders would be broadcast live. Actors would forget their lines and there'd be all sorts of problems. So he's now going to talk about animal programs. Animal programs were already established in the schedules when I first started. They were presented by George Cansdale, the superintendent of London Zoo. Week after week, he transported some of the more reasonably sized and amenable of his charges from Regent's Park to Alexandra Palace and put them on a table covered with a doormat, where they sat blinking in the intense lights of the studio, while Mr. Cansdale demonstrated their anatomy, their bravery, and their party tricks. He was an expert naturalist, marvellously adept at handling animals and persuading them to do what he wanted. Even so, things did not always go as he might have wished. That was part of his popularity. They regularly relieved themselves on the doormat, or, with luck, over his trousers. Occasionally they escaped and had to be fielded by one of the uniformed zookeepers lurking in the wings, ready for such an eventuality. And just to point out there, when he says relieve themselves, he means urinate or have a wee. So you can imagine that being live television with the animals weeing everywhere. Once, a small African squirrel leapt from the demonstration table onto the microphone, hanging on a boom directly above. From there, it scampered across the studio and found refuge in the ventilation system. It lived there for days, making occasional appearances in the dramas, variety shows, and epilogues that continued to come from its studio. On a few memorable occasions, an animal even managed to give Mr. Cansdale a nip. Such a moment was not to be missed, and when he produced a particularly dangerous creature, like a snake, the nation held its breath. Then in 1953, a new kind of animal program appeared. A Belgian explorer and filmmaker called Armand Denys, together with his glamorous British-born wife Michaela, came to London from Kenya to publicise a feature-length documentary they had made for the cinema called Below the Sahara. They had put some of the footage they had not used in the film into a half-hour programme for television. It showed elephants, lions, giraffe, and much of the rest of the famous and spectacular big game of the East African plains. It was a huge success. For many viewers, it was the first time they had seen moving pictures of such creatures. Although the images did not have the live, titillating unpredictability of those produced by Mr. Cansdale, people could see how marvellous and majestic the animals were in their proper setting. Viewers responded with such enthusiasm to this new kind of animal programme that the television planners immediately asked the Denises for more. Why not a whole series that could run week after week? The Denises, who had been filming in Africa for years and had a vast library of animal footage, saw the possibilities and needed little persuasion. So, the first On Safari series began. For me, a 26-year-old novice television producer with 2 years broadcasting experience and an unused zoology degree, don't know if you knew that about David Attenborough, but he has got a degree studying animals. Anxious to make animal programs myself, it seemed that each of these formats had its own particular attractions and its own limitations. Mr. Cansdale's had the undeniable thrill of watching living, unpredictable animals, but since the animals were always in an alien studio environment, they looked, more often than not, bizarre oddities. The Denis's animals, on the other hand, appeared in the natural surroundings to which they were perfectly adapted, but they lacked the spice of live unpredictability. Surely, I argued to myself, it should be possible to combine the two styles in one programme and get the benefits of both. I had already, as a jobbing producer, directed musical recitals, archaeological quizzes, political discussions, and ballet performances. Most recently, I had devised a series of 3 programmes about the meaning and purpose of animal shapes and patterns. They had been narrated by one of the great scientific figures of the times, Sir Julian Huxley, and to illustrate his words, I had borrowed some of the animals from Mr. Cansdale's London Zoo. And in doing that, I had met the zoo's curator of reptiles, Jack Lester. Jack, from his earliest days, had had a passion for animals, but lacking any formal training, he had first taken a job in a bank. However, he soon persuaded his employees to send him to a branch in West Africa, and there he was able to indulge his enthusiasm for collecting and keeping reptiles. Excuse me a second. When the war came, he joined the Royal Air Force, but after it was over, he got a job in a private zoo in the west of England. From there, he had come to Regent's Park to care for the zoo's large collection of reptiles. His office was a small room in the reptile house, heated, like all the showcases, to a suffocating tropical temperature and filled with all kinds of cages containing his particular favourite creatures that were not needed for public exhibition. Dwarf bush babies, giant spiders, chameleons, and burrowing snakes. He had been a great help in selecting the animals for the Huxley series, and I went there to discuss what more programs we might do together. I thought I had an idea that might interest him because it would get him back to his beloved West Africa, and I with him. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause there for this video. The likelihood is if you wanted to continue reading this with me, you can move on to the next video or do that on the next day. It's entirely up to you. And if you want a couple of little mini challenges then, particularly I know that some students are absolutely massive fans of animals and love them. I've got two challenges for you. What you could do is go back and look up some of these animals. For example, what is a dwarf bush baby? Because I couldn't tell you. Giant spiders, chameleons, burrowing snakes. And burrowing, I should say, not borrowing. Burrowing snakes. What are they? And there's probably different varieties of these as well. So you could go and look at that. I'd also recommend going off and Googling London Zoo, because I know a number of you maybe won't have ever been there before. So go away and Google London Zoo. And the other thing you could do as well is just go away on YouTube perhaps and look up this series. If you type in on safari, that'll bring up probably random results. But then if you add BBC and maybe even 1950s to it, you might even be able to find some of that early footage yourself on YouTube. I don't know, but I predict it's probably there. So thanks very much for listening for this bit, and we'll record another one for you shortly. Thank you very much, everybody. Goodbye.